Okay.
So it's on Facebook if you've seen Rabbi. The event's on Facebook.
Okay.
It was sent out in the e-newsletter. But yeah, we'll definitely promote it for the next one even better.
Okay.
But if I can just say, the best promotion is word of mouth, always. So to have 8, 9 people, I think we have 12 or 13 signed up. Hopefully more will actually come onto the class, but I have no doubt that it'll be amazing. So you can all tell your friends that it's amazing and that they should sign up too.
There we go. Okay, may I begin?
Sure.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm very excited. This is a wonderful endeavor that we're going to learn about Rashi. And Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, was considered to be the best and the most respected and the most studied Bible commentary, beginning from when he was alive, which is a pretty impressive feat because they didn't have any of the same electronics that we have now. And so being able to get the word out was extremely successful. And we're going to talk a little bit about his history and where he came from and so on. But he is considered to have been one of the greatest Jewish scholars of all time. He shared a commentary on the Talmud, which is the commentary to the Mishnah, which is the oral law. And we're not going to have anything to do with that. Our focus is going to be on the commentary that he offers on the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, but more importantly, on the 5 books of Moses, our Chumash. Can I just see a show of hands of those of you who are here? How many of you have studied Rashi in any intense way up until to this point? Okay. Anita, a little bit, good, 2. All right, and the rest of you, this is going to be a kind of like an exposure, and I'm going to tell you that the more I get into the preparations for this course, the more I am able to appreciate the success that Rashi enjoyed both in his lifetime and afterwards, because people wanted to study him, and we're going to talk about why, and we're going to talk about what the attraction is of Rashi's commentary, and we're going to learn some Torah. And during that learning of Torah, we're going to get a chance to really try and understand anyway what Rashi's rationale was to say what he says throughout the Torah. And there are all these things I want to say, but I don't want to go too fast, because I want us to be able to appreciate Rashi's life and his life work of commentaries, both of the Talmud, which as I said we're not going to deal with, and of the Torah, which we're going to deal with very intensely. I would like to ask that you don't have to have it now, but if you're able to procure in some way a Chumash or a Tanakh, which has both Hebrew and English, that would be a really good thing, because we go back and forth. We need to get context. So even if I have one verse that I want to study with you with regards to Rashi, I'm going to want us to get a bigger picture so that we can better understand the man and his comments. Who was Rashi? Well, Rashi was a man, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and I think I'm going to just write that on the board. I'll at least put it in the chat. Really, Shlomo ben Yitzchak. And he lived in France from 1040 to 1105 of the Common Era. He died when he was 65 years old, and his family was not wealthy. But his father was a vintner. He worked in the advocate. His vocation was winery. Rashi got a little bit of experience there, but he spent most of his time studying in yeshiva and then opening his own yeshiva. And his time was really spent in the books, whether the books were the Talmud or the Tanakh. He knew them both, and he knew them both as well as many of the outside literature, like Midrash, which is commentary that was outside of the realm of the legal system. The Midrashim that he learned were legends of the Jews that were really all over the place with regards to the kinds of things that were made available at his time. And remember, we're talking about the 11th century. There was no printing press. If you wanted to study Torah, for example, I mean, Talmud for sure, but if you wanted to study Torah, you had to have access to a text. And he did. He went to Germany when he was young, before he turned to 25. And he studied there with a rabbi by the name of Rabbeinu Gershon, Meor HaGolah. And Rabbeinu Gershon, I don't know if you're familiar with his greatness, but he was just a real sensitive person. And two of the things that Rabbeinu Gershon legislated in the 11th century, in the early 11th century, were included what is affectionately known as the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon, the excommunication of Rabbeinu Gershon, which would come about based on a number of things. The two that I want to mention are, if you open someone else's mail, you can be subject to excommunication. That was one of the things that he legislated. Opening somebody else's mail can subject you to excommunication. And the other thing, which was even more radical and more appreciated in my read, was he legislated that a woman could not be divorced without her consent. Until that point, it was said that a man could give a divorce whether or not the woman agreed to it, but he said no, there has to be some form of agreement. Now, not everybody plays by those rules, by that rule, and his cherem was ostensibly in place for 1,000 years, and that was up, I think, like about 25 years ago, something like that. And everybody said, well, it's been in place for so long, we're not even gonna visit it, and so it's still in place in that respect. So he was one of Rashi's main teachers. Another one was someone who was the rabbi of a community in Germany. And so Rashi, in his experience in Germany while he was studying there, he had a chance to not only learn Torah and Talmud excellently, which he did. He was a very talented student in that respect, but he also got a chance to see practical action of rabbis as he was there living in the area in Germany in which he studied. Well, it's my feeling that he was influenced by all that stuff. That when he came back to Troyes in France and he decided to open up a yeshiva, the yeshiva was one that really he wanted to attract people, not just because of the hard learning that they were doing, but also because of the atmosphere. And one of the things that he did was this major commentary, which was the Tanakh. Specifically, I'm going to just specifically focus on the Torah. And the bottom line, if there's a bottom line for Rashi, what made him so great was his ability to share a commentary that was both relevant and concise. It was purposeful in both of those levels. And when we talk a little bit more, and you'll see that his relevance was eclectic. He didn't beat any dead horses. He didn't, well, I'm going to take that back. There were some things that he did, which he had a plan about, and he did go overboard in in bringing a kind of commentary after another. But Rashi actually reacted and responded to the texts that were in front of him of the Torah text in a way that he wanted to bring two different elements. He was open to bringing two different elements to his community. And those two elements were pshat, which is essentially what I would call the plain meaning of the text, and drash, which is interpretation. And let me give you a little bit of history on this. Before Rashi, let's say in the 10th century, in the 9th century, and then before that, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th century as well, most of the commentary that was available in the world of biblical exegesis and learning would take a word, would take a phrase, would take even a letter, and go on the premise that that letter, word, or phrase has meaning in and of itself. And in order to derive that meaning, the commentators, the interpreters, would go very far afield, trying to teach their communities something. And the relevance that they were seeking was not necessarily specifically touching on the text itself, but rather on what can we derive from this text, which is good for us at our time, etc. And they would go a little bit far afield. They were not concerned with the pshat. That was an innovation that Rashi perfected during his lifetime. So, but however, at the same time, he also wanted to be a teacher. He didn't want to just say the plain meaning of the text is X. There would be times when he would want to give a message over to his community. And so, contrary to what many of you might have heard about Rashi in the past, he was not just a person who cared about pshat. He also cared about meaning, about getting a message across. And my friends, that message could go from anti-Christian polemics to how to treat one's family members, to the only way that we Jews can feel good about ourselves is if we feel angst or negatively about other characters in the text. And we're going to look at those in a few weeks, saying if they're bad, that makes us good. So that's okay. And he delved into a lot of different ways of trying to understand the text. As I said to you, he was eclectic. He did not have a consistent method of interpretation. It's my read that he went with what he thought would be best understood by his constituency. And his constituents were both beginners and scholars. And he succeeded. And that's the amazing part of Rashi. And if we wanted to boil down the kinds of interpretive devices that he used, just off the top of my head, I would list 5. And when we look at the text, we're going to see that these 5 are pretty much encompassed in everything that we study. Although I do want to say, don't take it to the bank. There might be places where Rashi does something else that's other than those 5, and he has every right to do that. I also want to tell you that what we have in our hands today as what we call Rashi's commentary may or may not be completely by the hand of Rashi. And the reason is because he had a student whose name was Shemaiah. And Shemaiah was his trusted student. And Shemaiah took down notes with what Rashi taught. Rashi also recorded his things, but also Shemaiah took down notes. Remember, we're talking about the 11th century. And as he's taking these notes, and he's in a Beit Midrash with other students, he would make a suggestion, or other students would make a suggestion. Is it possible for understand the text this way? And there are recordings of Rashi saying to these people, oh yeah, I could go with that. And in fact, later in his life, he wrote in one place, he said something to the effect of, if I had known, I wish that I had accepted more of these comments by my student Shemaiah and others to have included them in my commentary. Well, guess what, Rashi? Because there was no printing press, and because there was no way except to transcribe one manuscript onto another, it turns out that some of those glosses, some of the notes that Shemaiah and other students took, both in his lifetime and then after those manuscripts were proliferate and they got to other places in Western Europe, people would study and learn Rashi's approach, and they would also make notes in the sides of the manuscripts in the parchments of what they thought. And later, the editors and those after the early 15th century, when the printing press was invented, then those glosses oftentimes were incorporated into Rashi's program, Rashi's commentary. And we are at a point now where we are not always sure about whether or not Rashi said what we have in front of us. So we're always going to take what he said with a grain of salt, but he was okay with that because it's his method and it's his approach to try and understand the text, which is most important. And if other people could do what he could do, projecting totally, I would say that he was totally fine with that. So what were the things that he used in order to get his information across to the people? In no order of importance, please keep that in mind. I'm just what comes to my mind. The first thing was that sometimes there was a problem understanding what a word meant. So just like if we were reading the text and we said, what does that word mean, the Hebrew word, we would naturally try and explain it or translate it into English. Not Rashi. He went with the Old French. Okay, and so interspersed into his commentary are words that are in Old French. And I got to tell you, what he wrote or what he may have said, because somebody else might have transcribed it, very often we don't know what the words mean anymore because the way that dialects can be misrecorded when people are writing them down. So some of the things are pure speculation. Other things are pretty clear. For example, when God created Adam on the sixth day and he made him in his image. So the word, and you know French better than I do, so I'm just repeating what I have here. The word for image is, Rashi says in Old French, it's coin. And the word in Hebrew is matbea, which is like a stamp. And so the thing about making that was the way to explain how an image was, is that it was like a coin, a matbea. And so that word, we have kuf yud yud nun is the way that it was written. And so that's the kind of thing that we see. So that's the first of 5 ways that Rashi did his thing. The second one was also trying to explain to the people through translation. And so he used a very early translation of the Jewish Bible, and that was Targum Onkelos, which is an Aramaic translation, and most people think that it was the 2nd century BCE in which that Aramaic translation was offered. And it oftentimes was included on the early manuscripts. It would be like us having English. Okay, so he would go to Targum Onkelos and say, this word, which is a hard word, means this. So those are the 2 ways we translate into English, and he translated into Old French or into Aramaic. Then he expanded. And the other things that he would make very clear were important to him, the way that he would be bringing his commentary to the community. The third thing would be, he would quote midrashim, interpretive stories or explanations. And as I mentioned before, they did not necessarily have to respond directly to the text as it was, but rather they used the text as a springboard to do moral and ethical teachings, for example. And very often it was as a result of the early rabbis. We're talking about pretty much the 4th to the 7th centuries. CE. And they would find some kind of anomaly, what they perceived was an anomaly in the text. For example, it could be that the chronology was off, or the word was spelled differently than it's usually spelled, or there was something that was redundant, or that there was something that was redundant, or there were other elements that were a part of this, something was off in some way. And he would go back, he knew the text, he knew the Midrashic text, he would bring something and he would quote that. Sometimes he would give a reference and say, I got this from Breshit Rabbah, which was one of those early Midrashim, and sometimes he didn't. And so later, when others would read and they would know where he got it from, either because they had the text or they knew that that's where he got it, they would then put that in the gloss. And sometimes it made it into the text, and then Rashi gets credit for giving the reference. And sometimes it didn't, and then they criticized Rashi for not giving the references, but they were quotes. We're going to look at a couple of those today in the continuation of our time together. So that's number 3. Number 4 is that while he didn't focus all of his energy on grammar, he did have 2 grammar teachers. One was named Menachem ibn Saruk, and the other one was Dunash ibn Labrat. So let me just write that down because I have some fun stuff to share with you about this. He quotes these 2, Menachem ibn Saruk and Dunash ben Labrat. And Dunash ben Labrat cared about grammar. These are the grammarians. And Dunash ben Labrat cared about grammar. He was from the Spanish school of grammar. That's why I called him Dunash ibn Labrat, because the Spanish school went with an ibn, like Ibn Ezra. And he cared about the beat. That is to say, he wanted to look at the meter that the text was in. And he also wrote poetry. And there's a famous poem that Dunash ben Labrat wrote that was so wonderfully focused on Shabbat that it actually made it into our Zmirot. You know it as Doror Yikra. And if you look at Doror Yikra, if you open it up, you can see that the lines they spell out Dunash. And so that was attributed to him. And Rashi learned grammar from the 2 of them. And he spent, I went through the book of Breshit. And I tried to find all of the places where Rashi teaches a little grammar lesson. And I actually got to, how many letters are there in the English alphabet? Is it 22 or 26? 26? Yeah. So I found 26 cases of Rashi teaching a grammar lesson from something that was difficult to find in the text. And that session I like to call Rashi's grammar from A to Z, because there are 26 things that I found, and I didn't alphabetize them. I got to tell you, I was too lazy for that. But I did find 26 of them, and they're all, I have to tell you, like 22 or 23 of them I could teach today. In other words, we could learn biblical Hebrew grammar from Rashi just by studying his commentary. It's my speculation that those people who have studied Rashi in the past with intensity and with fervor get to these spots and they say, oh boy, another grammar lesson, and they skip it. And I think it's really too bad, because you could get a degree, not a degree, you could get a credits, university credits of biblical Hebrew grammar by studying the Rashi elements that he teaches with the grammar comments that he makes throughout just Bereshit. And then he goes on, and he does repeat himself sometimes. They didn't count in the 26 that I found, where he says, for example, when there's a hey at the beginning of a word that has a special vocalization. And let me just show you what that vocalization looks like. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Let's see. I don't have a chalkboard here. Let's see. No. Okay, I didn't want to do that. Okay. There we go. Resize. 1 second. So the vocalization I'm talking about, I'm going to come back here. The vocalization I'm talking about is where there's the line like this, that's called the patach, and there's the shva that's right next to it. That particular vowel sequence is the same as the upside down question mark in Spanish that anticipates a question about to be asked. So when you get to that you have a hey with that's called a chataf patach. When you have that particular vowel sequence, Rashi just about every time says a question is coming. And as I'm reading this, I say, I know that, Rashi. You don't have to tell us every time. So he's pretty repetitive about that, but he just did that because he wanted to make sure that nobody was aware, in case nobody was aware. So we've got 4 of the 5, and I would like to now open this up to you and ask you, what do you think was method number 5 or criterion number 5 that Rashi chose to communicate with the people? Bev, did you want to suggest something, or Mort? Mort. No?
We're thinking.
Okay. Adam.
Repetitive word.
Adam L.
Oh, it was not an answer to this question, but I actually did some genealogical research at one point, and Rashi is my great-grandfather 27 times removed.
Excellent.
So I
Congratulations.
should know the answer, but I don't.
I was just going to say, so you definitely should know this one.
And another descendant of his was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who's my 6th great-grandfather, who I should know the answer, but I don't.
Right. Okay. And I believe that there was also Rabbi Moshe Isserlis was also in that family tree.
Well, that's what I'm looking on the tree now. I'm going to look for this one too.
Okay. So does anybody want to suggest what it was that Rashi chose as his 5th method of getting this learning across to the community? It's a little bit unfair on my part, because the 5th one is what I would call Rashi's thoughts and messages. That is to say, he didn't go to another language. He didn't go to another text. He didn't go to the grammar. He just said, I think it's this. Or I want to get a message across to the community, so I am going to get that message across using this text as a pretext, as it were. And he just shared his own thoughts and his own beliefs and his own messages to the people. And when I talk about messages, I want you to remember that he's living in 11th century France. And France and Spain, life was not perfect for the Jews during that time. There was a massacre in 1096, for example, somewhere in that vicinity. I don't exactly remember where it was, but he really felt compelled to support his fellow Jew who would read his texts with additional comments that were that would be what we say in Hebrew, nogea lalev, that would touch the heart, that would be really resonate with the people. And what was amazing is that throughout all 5 of these methods that he used, he worked very hard on being concise. And it was as if people were studying the text, and they would be studying the biblical text, and they would get to something and they'd say, I'm not sure what that is. And they'd look up and there's Rashi's comment. It was like he could anticipate what his followers and what his students wanted to know. And he was able to achieve a huge success by writing those things in short, concise manner most of the time. And based on what I've shared with you so far, I would be willing to bet that some of those longer Rashis that go on and on and on weren't even his, that they were somebody else who said, I think I know what Rashi would say here, and that they would write it, and then it would make it into the manuscripts, and then it would be duplicated and so on. So in the 15th century, the printing press was invented, and there was a fellow by the name of Bomberg. He is given credit for printing the first Talmud. And it's likely he also dabbled in Tanakh, but the ones that we have that were the earliest manuscripts were put together by the Sensino family. So they were Italian, and they're the ones that really worked hard on making Rashi a very important part of the study of biblical texts. And the way that they did that is they chose, now we're talking about late 15th, early 16th century. They chose a font to set Rashi off apart from the biblical text. We're talking 16th century. Rashi's been dead for a few hundred years, and yet that particular font is known as Rashi script. My bet is that if Rashi had opened a Chumash with Rashi script, he would have said, I can't read this, because it's a different font that's a little bit more difficult to understand. It's tricky, let's put it that way. But that was the Rashi script, and that's how Rashi was set apart from the other elements on the page of the Tanakh. When it was called the Mikraot Gedolot, the great Bible text, Mikraot Gedolot, and it had these commentaries, one of which was Rashi, and it had this special font. So the way that we're going to study Rashi, we're only going to get like a little bit of a taste today, but I want to do that so that you'll come back next week. And as the cantor said, and you'll tell your friends, you say, you got to come to this because it'll just put Rashi in such a different light than I've ever seen. I have a thesis, my friends, and this thesis is not corroborated by all that many people. And my thesis that's based on this notion that Rashi really cared about his students and the people that were reading his text was that he was not methodical. He reacted to the text. And of course, like all of us human beings, when we react to a text, we do it because of the lenses that we have in our eyes and the prism through which we see not just the text, but also the life that's around us. And he just went with the flow. And the things that were important to him included wanting to be able to understand what was in the text, to address the possible Christian influences that were in his community at his time, to support 11th century European Jewry, which, just like any century Jewry, had its huge and very intense adherents, and also had those who said, you know what, it would be so much easier for me to assimilate because I really don't get a lot out of being Jewish. Well, he wanted to address them too because he realized that they were a very important part of the Jewish community. And also, I said, to combat the Christian influence, he also wanted to take a chunk out of Christianity at times, and even Islam, almost as if to say, if you read my text, you'll see that I don't care much for those religions, So come back and be a part of this religion, because I'll show you in other places where it's just the greatest religion of all. And he did that in a number of different ways. My notes here say to me, hundreds of super commentaries, hundreds of individuals and groups have made it their business to try their best to bottle Rashi and say, we know what Rashi's all about. And they won't succeed, because my thesis is that he said, you try to understand why I say what I say. Well, I've got some reasons, but don't work so hard to try and put me into a box and say, this is what Rashi does. The closest we come to that is not about what he wants to get across, but what his motivation was, to how he reacted to the text. So we have this notion, and in Hebrew it's called Ma kasheh l'Rashi, and in English we say, what's bothering Rashi? And that works pretty much like 95% of the time, that you can look up and say, I didn't understand that because it's superfluous, or because there's a lacuna in the text. There's something missing, or there's a grammatical inconsistency. And so something's wrong. Ma kasheh l'Rashi, what's bothering Rashi about this? When we study together in the next number of weeks, we're going to do our best to try and anticipate what Rashi's going to say by asking that question, what's bothering Rashi? But I am taking from Rashi, and I have to tell you, he's sitting right next to me here. You can't see him, but he is sitting next to me here, and he keeps saying, Markose, don't worry about it. Just learn the stuff that's there. Don't try and figure out why everything is like it is, because you're not going to figure it out, because that's not how I worked. I just reacted to the text, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to react to the text. Many people have believed that Rashi was the Pshat king, that all he did was try and give us the plain meaning of the text in his commentary. And that's just simply not true. Much of the time, he would say, here is the Pshat, and then he would give us either Unkelis or Old French or one of the other things that I mentioned to you. And then he would go on and say, and there's a midrash that says the following. And then we have to ask the question, why did he do that? Is it because the Pshat was weak? It's like the rabbi who's giving a sermon and he has in his notes, he's got a thing, weak point, talk louder. So Rashi says, I can't get this, I can't be convincing here, so I'm going to give another explanation. He says, davar acher, another explanation. Is it that he lacked confidence, which a lot of people say that is the case, and it might be? Or is it that he says, and I'd like to add something, even though the pshat is here for you to understand the plain meaning, I'd also like to communicate something else. And the something else has to do with some of the things I talked about, the attempt to strengthen the identities of the Jews, to take a shot at other religions, to teach moral and ethical ideas, to acknowledge the difficulties of being a Jew, all sorts of things. So maybe he added something in order to do that. But my friends, the best way that we possibly could, the second best way that we could find out what Rashi's motivation was, the first possible way is by asking him, right? He's right here, so we could ask him, but he's not going to answer. So the second way is by finding a text that tells us that in which Rashi says, I'm here to do the following. So let's do that now if we can. I'm going to get rid of the chat and I am going to open the screen. Can I just see a high sign that you can see Genesis 3 verse 8? Okay, we're good there? Excellent. Okay, so what do we have? And if you have your own Tanakh, it's always better. I'm using Sefaria, with a gun pointed to my head because I don't like Sefaria at all. I hate their translations, not of the biblical text, because they're just getting it from JPS, but some of the commentaries that they translate, they really are just, it's subpar, I would have to say. So let's look at the beginning of chapter 3, where we're told right at the end of chapter 2 that the end of chapter 2. In verse 25, we're told that the two of them were naked, the man and his wife, yet they felt no shame. Then we introduced the Nachash. The Hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden?" The woman replied to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It's only about fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die." The serpent said to the woman, "You're not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like a divine beings who know good and bad." When the woman saw that the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. Okay, so that's the prelude to this very strange verse. Let's look at verse 8, everybody. Do I have a volunteer to read verse 8? Either in the Hebrew or in the English, or both. Okay, Asher. Asher raised his hand first, and I really want to encourage him.
וישמעו את קול השם אלוקים מתהלך בגן לרוח היום ויתחבא האדם ואשתו מפני השם אלוקים בתוך עץ הגן.
Translate.
So they heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day, and the man and his wife hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden.
Okay, thank you. Let's look at this verse and let's just ask a few questions. I'm going to ask you to participate here. What could be problems that arise in this particular text? What do you see that could be a difficulty that would need some kind of addressing?
Right, anyways.
Shirley.
So wouldn't God know where he is? Where are you? Is
Why?
that the verse?
No, that's verse 9.
Right.
That's where God calls to man and
Right,
says to him,
okay.
Ayeka. But verse
Right.
8, what do we have here? We got some things here that, like, just be open and let the text, like, speak to you and say, wait a minute, something's wrong with this. Something doesn't make sense here. It's, okay, go ahead, Morton.
Well, why are they hearing the voice of God walking in the garden? I don't understand. Are you hearing walking in the garden, or are you hearing the voice?
Okay, so Morton, you're right on. And there's a problem with voices. First of all, the voice of God, like, do we know, is this words? How is God's voice? That's one thing. The second thing is walking in the garden. Is it God that's walking in the garden? Or is it the voice, or is it the sound that's walking in the garden? And either way, it's problematic because it's going to be anthropomorphic or some kind of walking that is not human beings here. And so we have a problem with the word mithalech, walking about, moving about. So they heard et kol Hashem Elokim mitalech bagan. Is it they heard the kol of God mitalech, or is it that they heard the sound of God walking in the garden. Do y'all see how you could understand that in more than one way? Because the verse itself does not give us a clear indication of whether it's the voice that's walking or whether it's God that's walking. But as Mort said so correctly, either way, there's some walking going on in this garden that is problematic. Also, L'Ruach Hayom, Asher, you translated that, you translated from the translation, but L'Ruach Hayom from the
breezy time of day.
right. Like, is there a question you might want to ask about that?
How do you know when the breezy time of day is?
Okay, that's one. I got something else. Excuse my nastiness. Who cares? Like, why do we need to know when it was that they heard this, whatever it was that they heard? Why is that significant? All right.
Nicole could be maybe the Ruach. We don't know. We don't know.
No, that's very good. Is that if the coal is if what they heard was this sound of the wind, then that works very nicely. I think that that's very good. And Adam and his wife hid. They hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Betoch Eitz Hagan. Okay, so we got some of this. Trying to flesh it out a little bit. What's going on with this verse? We've got a problem, and the problem is that who's doing the walking? Is it or what's doing the walking? And so we're going to look and see what Rashi says. So I have Rashi here. Unfortunately, it's a little smushed. So I want to see if there's a way that I can like make it less smushed, but I don't think I can. All right. So here we go. So it says, I'm going to bring in the Hebrew first because the Hebrew is classic. And Sefaria doesn't let me do Hebrew and English of Rashi at the same time. Vayishma'u. So whenever Rashi teaches us something, he always gives us what's called a dibur hamatchil. He gives us an opening of the text itself, so we know where we're at. He was very good about that, and that's a part of his greatness, is he says, like, people don't have to say, wait a minute, where am I? Rashi tells us where he is. Vayishma'u, they heard. He says, Yesh midrashe agadah rabim. There are a lot of midrashim. Uchvar sidrum rabotenu al mechonam. Bibreshit Rabbah, uvishar midrashot. And he says, you know what? There are a lot of things that can be explained of this in midrashim, and they're all over the earlier texts that bring us all sorts of messages and all sorts of explanations and interpretations, and you can look them up if you want. However, he says, Va'ani lo vati ela lifshuto shel mikra ula agada hamiyashevet divrei hamikra davar davur al ofnav. I'm gonna go to the English so that we can understand that really well. And then he gives us his explanation of Vayishma'u. But before we do that, let's look at Rashi's unbelievable statement here. He says there are many midrashic explanations, and our teachers have already collected them in their appropriate places in Breshit Rabbah and in other midrashim. I, however, Rashi says, am only concerned with the plain sense of Scripture, Pshuto Shel HaMikra, and with such agadot. Agadot are legends or stories. Hamiyashevet, Agadah Hamiyashevet, et Hamiyashevet Divrei HaMikra, which Miyashevet. Anybody here care about the grammar that want to say what the three-letter root is in the word Miyashevet? Yoshev. Yoshev. And that means what, Mort?
Sit.
It sits well. So Miyashevet is to sit well. That's how I would like to translate this. So agadot that sit well with the words of Scripture in a manner, he says that explain the words in the Scripture in a manner that fits in with them. I think he means Miyashevet et Divrei HaMikra is it makes it make sense. It sits well with the reader. It doesn't have to be pshat. And my friends, the reason that it doesn't have to be pshat is because his lenses, he's acknowledging, I think, His lenses are different than anybody else's lenses. Everybody's lenses are different. And so it's going to sit well when it resonates. And he's going to try and bring things in that he thinks will resonate. And he succeeded incredibly. But he is not bound just to pshat. He's also willing to entertain this kind of comment that says, oh yeah, that's good too. I like that also. It fits well. He doesn't always bring in both pshat and drash. Sometimes it's just pshat. Sometimes it's just drash. Sometimes it's both. As I said, don't work yourself up over it because he is not consistent. He's eclectic. So how do we understand Vayishma'u? Let's look at the Hebrew. Vayishma'u. Ma sham'u. What did Adam and Eve hear? Sham'u et kol hakadosh baruch hu shehaya mitalech bagan. They heard the sound of the Holy One, blessed be he, which was, or who was, I'm not sure, which was walking in the garden, or who was walking in the garden. Rashi's comment here does not fix the problem that we raised. And that is it the sound that they heard, or is it God? Is it the sound that was traipsing through the garden, or was it God who was traipsing through the garden? That text continues not to be clear to us. However, any English translation that you will dare open to try and understand what Rashi was saying about the word Vayishma'u, they heard, Adam and Eve heard, will go as follows. Listen, what did they hear? They heard the sound of the Holy One, blessed be he, as he walked in the garden. He, capital H. My friends, that is a comment on Rashi's ambiguous explanation and interpretation. So, and that's going to happen, by the way, because every single one of you is going to say, yes or no, do you think it was God that was traipsing? Or was it the sound that was traipsing? And when you put it that way, it's much easier to anthropomorphize the deity, the divine, than it is to try and anthropomorphize a sound. Except that it's beruach, what are the words? Leruach hayom. Except that the text took time and energy to tell us that it was at the breezy time of day. Ruach is like wind, at the windy time of the day, the Ruach Hayom. And I would like to suggest that those words fly in the face of this translation that we get from Sefaria, and that somebody said, it was you, Adam L. You said that that's probably what they heard. And those of us who want to keep our feet planted, I had a rabbi who once told me that if my feet were on the ground and my head is in the clouds, I should probably be playing for the NBA. But if we want to keep our feet planted, and we can say, why does the text bother to tell us that it's L'Ruach Hayom and that they heard something? I can tell you here in Jerusalem that during the summertime, it gets really hot in the whole country of Israel. And in Jerusalem, it's hot during the day. And then come around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, amazingly, on a daily basis, there is this cool breeze that comes into play in Jerusalem. And we have a southeast opening in our apartment. We get this incredibly northwest wind that goes in the northwest direction that just cools the house off incredibly. And in fact, we've been living in this place for 27 years now. It was only like 5 years ago that we broke down and got an air conditioner. It was that cool here in Yerushalayim. And so I think that the L'Ruach Hayom, Adam, is going to give us, I would have been just as comfortable if it had said, Vayishma'u et kol Hashem Elokim mitalech began b'sha'a arba, at 4 o'clock p.m. And that's how the text could have read. And because at that time, that sound of the wind going through the trees, I think that that's what they heard. I think that that's the pshat, but I don't have a leg to stand on because Rashi says, I'm only here to give you pshat. And I say that they heard, and the words in Hebrew are ambiguous. Hashamu et kol hakadosh baruch hu shehaya mitalech bagan. The sound of the the sound of, in parentheses, the Holy One, blessed be he who is walking in the garden, or the sound of the Holy One, blessed be he, which, that is to say, the sound which was going around in the garden. We're no better off than we were before. And I think Rashi did that on purpose, because he said, you know what, you're trying to figure out what I'm trying to get across. I have something that I want to teach. Well, I'm going to teach it, and I'm going to do the best to give you pshat, or I'll do the best to give you a midrash that is meaningful, or I'll do something to make you think and to make you talk about it at your Shabbat table and to make you say, wait a minute, let me go through this again. He really made us care about the text in a way that nobody had up until that point, because he combined pshat and drash at such a fantastically adept level. Okay, we have another 3 minutes. Can I ask if there are any questions? I did a lot of talking here, but I'm open to questions.
Is there something that we should read ahead of next session?
That's the person in the class, Bev, who says, you didn't give us homework. Okay. Let's see, let me just pull out my notes here. I'll tell you what, let's do this. If you can't get it this way, I will send it to the cantor, and he will send it out to everybody in a different way. But I'm gonna put the next number of Rashis that we're going to be studying in the chat as a file, and you'll let me know if you get it, and if you can. Oh, I got to get out of it first. I was working on it just before I came here. Rashi course for Shari Zion Beth-El. Okay. Okay, so I'm sending that to you. And you can play Rashi with the stuff that I sent you. Can I just see a high sign that you got it? And if, okay, so Cantor, if you feel that there's another way to get it out to people, I'm happy to send it to you by email as an attachment. Okay, you'll let me know. So these are the texts that we're going to look at in the next few weeks or next week. It depends on how we do. But these are all places where Rashi claims to give us pshat. And the question is, can you find out what Rashi is reacting to, Makashela Rashi, and is his pshat compelling? And let's see if that works out. Okay?
Okay.
It's bruching to you. It's okay to read ahead, Bev. That's fine. You can read ahead if you want. But if you don't, because there are going to be new people coming on next week, so I want to be able to bring them in and have them feel like they're a part of the dynamics as well. Okay?
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Thank
Have
you,
a
Rabbi.
good week.
All right.
We'll see you later.
2 weeks.